Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, April 21st, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. Stoltenberg says that Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO. So on Thursday, NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg made his first visit to Ukraine since Russia launched its invasion last year. And he declared that Kiev's rightful place is as a member of the Western military alliance. Stoltenberg said at a press conference with Zelensky, quote, Ukraine's rightful place is in the Euro-Atlantic family. Ukraine's rightful place is in NATO, and over time, our support will help make that possible, end quote. So Ukraine was first promised NATO membership back in 2008, despite an explicit warning at the time from William Burns, who's currently the CIA director. At the time, he was the U.S. ambassador to Russia. And in a memo to Condoleezza Rice, he said, Ukrainian NATO membership is the brightest of all red lines for Moscow. And then, between then and 2014, really after Yanukovych, who was the president that was ousted in the 2014 coup, was elected in 2010, Russia didn't really have to worry too much about NATO's cooperation with Ukraine. But after the coup in 2014, NATO significantly stepped up its support for Ukraine, which Stoltenberg alluded to in his comments. He said, quote, over the years, NATO allies have provided training for tens of thousands of Ukrainian soldiers, end quote. So, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Stoltenberg has repeatedly pledged Ukraine would eventually become a member, but Kiev has never been given a timeline. So, some NATO members want to give a clearer statement to Ukraine, want to give them some sort of outline on what, how it could become, a full fledged NATO member. And they want to do this at this summit that's coming up in Lithuania in July. But the US is reportedly pushing back against the plan. Apparently, the US and Germany and Hungary are all on the same page. This was as of a few weeks ago that they didn't want to give Ukraine any more guarantees. But countries like Poland and the Baltic states are more gung ho about it. So Zelensky has been invited to this NATO summit that will be held in July, and Stoltenberg says that he expects discussion about stronger NATO support for Kiev. Stoltenberg said, quote, I also recognize that President Zelensky will raise the issue of membership, of security guarantees, and this will be high on the agenda of the meeting, end quote. But whatever happens at the summit, either way, NATO already has very long-term plans for Kiev. Stoltenberg said that he discussed a multi-year support initiative with Zelensky to make Ukraine's armed forces more interoperable with NATO. He said, quote, it is a testament to NATO's long-term commitment to Ukraine. NATO stands with you today, tomorrow, and for as long as it takes, end quote. So Stoltenberg's visit to Ukraine, it comes as there's no end in sight to the war. There's no sign that this thing is going to wind down. Pentagon documents that were allegedly leaked by Jack Teixeira revealed that the U.S. does not think peace talks will happen this year, and they also don't think Ukraine can regain any significant territory in a planned counteroffensive. So they just expect this war to go on and keep supporting it and keep risking, a war with Russia. Stoltenberg, while he was in Kiev, he acknowledged that he does not know how long the war will last. He said, quote, we do not know when this war will end, but we know that Russian aggression is a toxic pattern that must be stopped, end quote. NATO's plans for Ukraine will prolong the war as the alliance's support for the country was one of Moscow's main motives for invading. Before launching its attack on Ukraine, Russia sought a guarantee from the U.S. that Kiev would not ever join NATO, but the Biden administration refused to engage on that issue. A State Department official admitted that after the invasion. So also on Thursday, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, he reaffirmed that preventing Ukrainian NATO membership is one of Moscow's war goals. He said, quote, of course, because otherwise this will pose a serious, significant threat for our security, for our country's security, end quote. So, more signs that this thing's not going to end. This is NATO's plan. Just dangle membership in front of Ukraine, even though they know that's really the one thing that's unacceptable for Russia, that they don't want to negotiate. In the beginning of the war, when there was negotiations between Russia and Ukraine that were ultimately discouraged by the West, the real one main demand that Russia wanted was Ukrainian neutrality. It's clearly their biggest issue here, and by making these promises, it's just going to ensure that the war is going to continue. All right. So the next one here, GOP lawmakers say that they won't support unrestrained Ukraine aid. So a group of Republican members of Congress have told President Biden that they will not support more unrestrained aid for Ukraine. And I got this from a report in Responsible Statecraft. So the lawmakers said in a letter to President Biden, quote, a proxy war with Russia in Ukraine is not in the strategic interest of the United States, and it risks an escalation that could spiral out of control, end quote. The letter was signed by 3 Republican senators, Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and J.D. Vance, and 16 Republican members of the House. They noted that recent aid the U.S. has pledged, including the M1 Abrams tanks, will require months of training, will take a long time to deliver. And they said that signals that the administration is ready for a war, for a long-term conflict. They said, quote, the current strategy of sanctions and drawn-out aid will only prolong the conflict, leading to escalation and more violence. Our national and economic security demand an alternative. Unrestrained U.S. aid for Ukraine must come to an end, and we will adamantly oppose all future aid packages unless they are linked to a clear diplomatic strategy designed to bring this war to a rapid conclusion, end quote. So the lawmakers warned of the risk of provoking a direct war with Russia. They said, quote, Russian tolerance for fighting a proxy war with NATO could run out at any point. The decision to invade Ukraine should be evidence enough of Putin's willingness to use military force and should give us pause in continuing to push the limits at the risk of catastrophe, end quote. So much of this Republican opposition to arming Ukraine is because they believe the U.S. should be focused on building up in the Asia Pacific to prepare for a future conflict with China. Unfortunately, that's what a lot of them think. It's not so. They have their preferred intervention in Taiwan. Not all of them. I think Rand Paul's actually been good on Taiwan, and he did sign this letter. But this did come through in the letter that's what they think the U.S. should be focused on. They said, quote, should our actions entangle us in a confrontation with Russia now, or should conflict erupt in the Indo-Pacific in the coming years? We fear that our military will be woefully unprepared to meet these challenges as a direct result of what has been shipped to Ukraine, end quote. The Republicans closed the letter by calling on President Biden to push for a diplomatic solution. They said, quote, we strongly urge you to advocate for a negotiated peace between the two sides, bringing this awful conflict to a close, end quote. Then I just listed here the members of the House that signed it. Eli Crane, Mary Miller, Paul Gosar, Andy Biggs, Matt Gaetz, Anna Paulina Luna, Dan Bishop, Barry Moore, Lauren Boebert, Tim Burchett, Andy Ogles, Ralph Norman, Matt Rosendahl, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Mike Collins, and Josh Breshin, if I said that right. So at 16, I didn't see Thomas Massey on there. Maybe the letter wasn't hardcore enough for him. I don't know, or they just didn't get to him. But when they did vote for that big $40 billion Ukraine aid package last year, that was one of the only ones that was a single vote. All the other ones have been rolled into different legislation. So from that vote, you could really tell where the people stand. And there was, I believe it was 40 something House Republicans that voted against it. So there has been kind of this small Republican opposition to this for a while. Is it going to be enough to really change anything? I'm not sure. So far, Congress has authorized about $113 billion to spend on the war in Ukraine. The Biden administration is still drawing funds from the $45 billion that they approved in December. And that aid is expected to be exhausted by the summer, which means the White House is likely going to be asking Congress for more soon. And one thing the Biden administration has expressed to Ukraine is that they don't think Congress is going to approve the aid. I actually think they probably could get it, because they have enough Republicans and all the Democrats would probably support it. So who knows if they're going to try to get another one of these really big packages, or maybe they're going to narrow it down a little more just to weapons or something. All right, the next one here. Ukraine's foreign minister slams the EU for not delivering on ammunition plan. So, Ukrainian Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba slammed the EU on Thursday for taking too much time to work out its plan to deliver 1 million artillery shells to Ukraine for its war against Russia. Kuleba wrote on Twitter, quote, "The inability of the EU to implement its own decision on the joint procurement of ammunition for Ukraine is frustrating," end quote. The EU has been trying to work out a plan to jointly purchase the artillery rounds. According to Politico, the main impasse between EU members is whether to restrict the 1 billion euros that they've set aside for this, if they should restrict it just to manufacturers in the EU, or if they should look to procure ammunition from the US and Britain. So, coordinating EU military aid and sanctions, it usually takes time. There's a lot of countries in the EU. They've been working on this plan for a few weeks. But Kuleba has made clear Kiev is running out of patience. He said, quote, "This is a test of whether the EU has strategic autonomy in making new crucial security decisions," end quote. So there he's referring to what Macron said, calling for European independence from US policies. There he was speaking specifically about China and Taiwan. So throughout the war, Kuleba and other Ukrainian officials, they have been willing, they're not afraid to really criticize their Western backers, even though their war effort is entirely reliant on such support. Earlier this year, Kuleba said that no one has done enough to support Ukraine. And Zelensky, when he went to Congress and addressed Congress, he said, some similar stuff there. So they're not afraid to say, they're getting all this aid. They're not afraid to say, give me more, keep it coming. But when it comes to ammunition, it's something that they are desperate for. So we'll see if they get those million shells. All right, the next one here. I left up the one from yesterday about the DOJ indicting those Americans over their political views on Russia, because it's just a really big story and, people should really be aware of it. But the next one, U.S. and its allies consider a ban of all exports to Russia. So this is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute. And it says that the U.S. is in discussion with several Western partners about outright ending trade with Russia. The debate is occurring at the U.S.-led as the U.S.-led economic war on Russia has failed to stop Moscow's war machine in Ukraine. So according to Bloomberg, members of the G7 are considering banning exports to Russia outright. The debate is occurring among member states, the U.S., Britain, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and the European Union ahead of an international summit in May. So members of the G7 have maintained significant exports to Russia since Washington declared it would isolate Moscow using sanctions. According to trade data, $66 billion in goods have flowed to Russia from member states. The proposed ban would essentially switch the way Washington outlaws trade with Russia. Currently, the U.S. and its allies are blacklisting Russian products, companies, and individuals. And if this export ban is adopted, it will prohibit all trade with Moscow that is not explicitly exempted from Western sanctions. So that would be a pretty big deal. According to the reports, food and medicine would be on the exemption list. But of course, as history shows us, and I'm always talking about that, even though there's exemptions, they also cause shortages of these goods for various reasons. This would be a pretty big deal. I would be surprised if all the G7 countries agreed to this, but because it would be a pretty huge deal. But we'll see what happens at that summit. Their foreign ministers just met and said that they want to expand sanctions on Russia. So we'll see what they decide next month. All right, the next one here. GOP rep says the U.S. needs to arm Taiwan to the teeth. So this is Mike Gallagher. He's the head of that new committee on China, and they conducted those war games on Wednesday, and he said that the results show that the U.S. must arm Taiwan to the teeth. And these war games, which I went over yesterday, didn't get too many results from them. They didn't share too much information about them, but Gallagher said in a statement, quote, "We are well within the window of maximum danger for a Chinese Communist Party invasion of Taiwan, and yesterday's war games stressed the need to take action to deter CCP aggression and arm Taiwan to the teeth before any crisis begins," end quote. So the war game, again, was conducted by the Center for New American Security, the CNS think tank. They receive funding from U.S. weapons makers. They receive funding from the U.S. government. They receive funding from the Taiwanese government. So, you got to keep those uh, conflicts of interest in mind there. A source close to the China committee, told Reuters that the war games conclusions were that a U.S.-China fight over Taiwan would result in high U.S. losses, the depletion of long-range missiles, and would leave global markets in absolute tatters. So it sounds like something we should avoid. And Gallagher and all the other China hawks are saying, oh, we have to avoid this by arming Taiwan. But China has made clear that more U.S. support for Taiwan is going to make a war more likely. All right, let's see. The next one here. The U.S. is preparing for a potential evacuation of their embassy in Sudan. So the Pentagon is sending more troops to Djibouti to prepare for a potential embassy evacuation from Sudan, as the forces of rival generals have been battling in the capital of Khartoum. So fighting in Sudan entered its sixth day on Thursday after several failed attempts at a ceasefire. So the fighting is between Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, who is Sudan's army chief and de facto leader, and Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, who is the commander of a paramilitary force known as the Rapid Support Forces, the RSF. So U.S. officials have said that any evacuation would only focus on getting embassy staff out of Sudan, not U.S. citizens who are in the country. Khartoum's airport has been damaged by shelling, making it difficult for people to leave the country. According to an estimate from the World Health Organization, at least 330 people have died in the fighting. Earlier this week, there were reports that a U.S. diplomatic convoy came under fire, and Antony Blinken, he spoke with the generals, both of them, and he warned them, not to attack Americans. So both Al-Burhan and Dagalo, just a little background. Again, I don't know much about Sudan, but some stuff I wanted to point out about recent history when it comes to the U.S. Sudan relationship. So Al-Burhan and Dagalo, they were involved in the ousting of Omar al-Bashir, who ruled Sudan for a long time, from 93, and he was ousted in 2019. And this briefly led to better U.S.-Sudan relations. In 2020, the U.S. removed Sudan from the list of state sponsors of terror after 27 years for agreeing to normalize ties with Israel. That was their reward. So while that government at the time agreed to normalize with Israel, they have not yet worked out a deal to establish diplomatic ties. So the Trump administration also made Sudan pay $335 million in compensation to victims of the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania that were carried out by al-Qaeda. But in 98, Osama bin Laden was not in Sudan. He was expelled from Sudan in 1996. According to the Washington Post, al-Bashir actually offered to arrest and extradite him, before this attack. So in response to the embassy attacks, the U.S. bombed a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant in Sudan, in Khartoum. So they, claimed it was some kind of al-Qaeda weapons facility, but that turned out to not be true. It was a medicine factory. They bombed it. And then, 20 years later, they make Sudan pay all this compensation to the victims. So it's totally ridiculous that they had to pay that. But anyway, U.S.-Sudan relations deteriorated again in 2021 when al-Burhan launched another coup that disrupted the country's efforts to transition into a civilian-led government. So he took power with Dagalo, who he's fighting right now. He was his deputy, and I guess they got sick of each other. I'm not sure exactly what sparked the conflict. But the U.S. suspended aid to Sudan in response to this 2021 coup. And then Khartoum actually grew a little closer to Russia after that. Earlier this year, al-Burhan's government agreed to allow Russia to build a Red Sea naval base in Sudan, although they did say that the deal hinged on it being approved by a future civilian parliament that still needs to be established. So he was still, I guess, trying to create this parliament, this civilian-led government. But now, there's chaos in the capital there, and it's not really clear who's, in charge of the country right now. But it looks like it's definitely something to keep an eye on, if the U.S. military is going to go in there to get the people out of the embassy. All right, the next one here, a U.S. B-1 bomber drills in India for the first time. So the U.S. has deployed a pair of B-1B Lancer bombers to participate in exercises in India, marking the first time that the aircraft is conducting drills in the country as military ties between Washington and New Delhi are growing. The 2023 iteration of the US India COPE exercises is being held at an Air Force station in the eastern Indian state of West Bengal. The drills started on April 13th and will last until the 24th. Other US aircraft are participating, including F-15 fighter jets, C-130 cargo planes, and C-17 transport aircraft. So the first time one of these B-1 bombers landed in India was in 2021 for an air show, but this is the first exercise that they're participating in. According to Air and Space Forces magazine, B-1s have become a regular sight in the Indo-Pacific region lately as the U.S. began sending them to fly with South Korea as tensions on the Korean peninsula are soaring. So the U.S. started sending bombers there again. They weren't doing that for a while, but they're back at it. In recent years, the U.S. has stepped up military cooperation with India as part of its strategy against China. The cooperation includes joint military exercises with the Quad nations, which is the U.S., India, and also Australia and Japan. So while U.S.-India ties have frayed a bit over the war in Ukraine, it seems like the U.S. has given up on trying to get, not to get them to stop buying Russian oil. They didn't try to enforce the price cap on them or anything. I think they've kind of just accepted that. And this is, I think they see India as a big tool that they could use against China. At the same time, India, even though they are, growing closer to the US militarily, they still are balancing things. They're not going to go all in against China. But the most volatile area is that disputed border that they have in the Western Himalayas. So in 2020, the US and India signed an intelligence sharing deal known as the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement. So this agreement has allowed the U.S. to assist India with the surveillance of Chinese troops along the disputed border in the Western Himalayas, known as the Line of Actual Control. U.S. News reported that the U.S. provided India with unprecedented intelligence sharing during an unarmed clash between Indian and Chinese troops along the LAC in December 2022. So that's a big deal. I think this cooperation with India on the border there is a pretty huge deal. Just because it's volatile, 20 Indian troops were killed there in the summer of 2020. And that it was after that the US and India signed this deal. So it's, we're one, things could, you just never know with a situation like that when it could really escalate into a bigger conflict. And then we're just one step away of backing India against a proxy war against China, backing a proxy war that would involve two nuclear powers. So it's definitely a dangerous situation there. And again, another part of the intelligence sharing is that they could use that for missile strikes, drone strikes. That's something that India is happy about. All right, the next one here. Iran claims that it forced a U.S. submarine to the surface. So Iran's Navy commander said Thursday that an Iranian submarine made a U.S. submarine come to the surface as it entered Iranian waters in the Strait of Hormuz, a claim that the U.S. military later denied. So this is Commander Shahram Irani. He is the head of Iran's Navy. He said, quote, the U.S. submarine was approaching while submerged, but the Iranian submarine, Fateh, detected it and carried out maneuvers to force it to surface as it went through the Strait of Hormuz. It had also entered into our territorial waters, but it corrected its course after being warned, end quote. So a spokesman for the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet based in Bahrain denied that a U.S. submarine was in the area. So this is Commander Timothy Hawkins. He's a spokesman over there. And so he said, totally denied the idea that a U.S. submarine was even in the Strait of Hormuz on the same day. So who knows what the story is with that. But earlier this month, this Hawkins guy announced the deployment of a U.S. guided missile submarine to the region, which he said was capable of carrying 154 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles. So the announcement was clearly a message to Iran. It came as tensions were very high, and the U.S. rarely reveals the location of its submarine, so there's no purpose to announce it other than send a message, to somebody. And in this case, it's clearly Iran. And the U.S. is also stepping up its naval patrols through the Strait of Hormuz by using drone boats. This was on Wednesday. The same spokesman, Hawkins, announced that the U.S. sailed a 41-foot drone speedboat known as a Mast 13, through the Strait of Hormuz for the first time. He said the boat was observed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, but transited the strait without incident. So the Strait of Hormuz is pretty narrow um, between Iran and Oman, and the U.S. does have a big presence here. There's been encounters last year between U.S. Coast Guard. The U.S. Coast Guard is over there near Iran's coast, and there's encounters between Iranian vessels and the U.S. Coast Guard. So it is always, an area where things could get tense between the U.S. and Iran. All right, the last one here. So this is from Li Fang, his Substack, and it's about a House Democrat that threatened Matt Taibbi with prosecution and imprisonment. So I haven't been following that. This is over the Twitter files. I haven't been following it too closely, but I know Taibbi addressed Congress on his reporting, and then he did this interview with this Mehdi Hassan guy over at MSNBC, and he accused him of getting some facts wrong, and it turned out he just had an abbreviation wrong in a tweet, and nothing that he said in his testimony to Congress was wrong. But this woman, this House, Stacey Plaskett, who's she's not a voting House representative. She's a delegate that represents the Virgin Islands. But she sent a letter to Matt Taibbi, basically threatening him with jail, saying that he intentionally provided false information. But Lee has been on top of this story, and he, debunked that claim. But it's really something to see a member of Congress send a letter to a journalist and threaten them with jail. So go check that out. It's at his Substack. But that is it for the news for today. You can go check out our viewpoints. We have one from Thomas Knapp, a counter proposal, restrict the restrictors, talking about the Restrict Act. One from Judge Knapp, secrecy versus truth. One from Ramsey Baroud, quest for religious war, how Israel is unifying Arabs and Muslims around Palestine. One from Daniel Larison, don't look to militarists for anti-war foreign policy. And our spotlight is from Ted Snyder, the most important line in the joint China-France statement. So that's everything for today. You can always go check out the blog. We have some good videos in there. Ron Paul's Liberty Report about the DOJ indictments against those Americans. We have a video from Jimmy Dore. He interviewed Dan McKnight, who's the leader of the Defend the Guard movement and Bring Our Troops Home, which is a really important movement. So it's always there's always good stuff in there. But that is it for me for the week. I'll be back after the weekend. You could always support us at antiwar.com/donate. Like and subscribe on YouTube, Odyssey, and Rumble. I talked to Rumble today. I think my videos are going to be good on there. It's been kind of annoying, but hopefully there's not any problems anymore. But that's it. I'll talk to you after the weekend. Thanks for listening.